first place in my league. Got a blockbuster on the way and a pickup up my sleeve. They call my team insane, say I'm the one to beat. So you better bring your A game and start playing, cause every single...
Welcome to another episode of the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational Podcast. I am Justin Mason, lead fantasy writer and analyst at friendsoffantasybenefits.com. I have another fantastic episode for you today. I was joined by Dan Harris of fantasypros.com. And Dan is just such a great guy. I've gotten to know him over the course of the last year or so. And he's a really fantastic analyst, does a really great job covering football and baseball over at Fantasy Pros. But he's the editor-in-chief over there. He's the head honcho, and he kind of gives us a little bit of the behind-the-scenes look at what it takes and what it's like to run an operation of that size. So I really appreciated him coming on. You can follow him at Dan Harris 80. So here's my interview with Dan Harris of Fantasy Pros. Joining me now is Dan Harris from Fantasy Pros. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. I'm still in that newbie phase where getting to talk to you is like a highlight of my day. So it's really cool. Thank you for having me on.
I mean, I feel like you've got to come up with better highlights for your day if a highlight is talking to me.
Okay, just to be clear, my day involved waking up at 5 a.m., recording a podcast with Joe Pisapia from my mother's house in New York, and then taking a 5-hour drive back to New Hampshire. So if this was not the highlight of my day, we would have major problems right now. All
right. Well, I mean, I love talking with Joe. Joe's a good buddy of mine. He's a great person to talk to. So, but no, I'm better to talk to than Joe. I get that.
Absolutely.
Dan, remind people where you can reach on social media, and then talk about a little bit about what you do over at Fantasy Pros.
Yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Dan Harris 80. I am the editor-in-chief of both Fantasy Pros and Betting Pros. So I'm kind of a hybrid role, right? Where I direct the content and I make some hiring and firing decisions. Joe Pisapia, our good friend, I was happy enough to make the decision to hire him. But I do a lot of content on both sides. I hosted the Fantasy Pros football podcast last year. Thankfully, I'm not going to be doing that again this year. Joe's going to take over that. And Joe and I co-host the Fantasy Pros baseball podcast, which we call Leading Off every weekday. So it's, it's a nice mix, hybrid of kind of management and putting out content.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we kind of delve into you, but I definitely want to learn a little bit about kind of what that's like on a day-to-day basis for sure, because not everybody I get to talk to has that kind of role where they're at. But first I want to talk about your TGFBI team. And let me just ask, how's it going so far?
Oh, it's going terribly, really terribly. And I can't tell you how upset I am about this because, so there are a couple things. Number one, I know there was a big kerfluffle a couple of weeks ago, obviously, about, whether or not everybody pays as much attention to their team as they should. I'm one of those people who pays attention to every team, even when I'm long out of it, right? We can be in September and I'm in second to last place. I'm still making moves, trying to get up one spot. That's just kind of how I am. And with this one, of course, this great event where all these analysts are in the last 2 years, because New Hampshire, where I live, has a different school vacation than every other state in the country to maximize ski revenue, actually. So Vermont and New Hampshire have different ones. So I'm always on a beach with my wife and kids drafting my TGFBI team from my phone. So I like to blame kind of my mediocre drafts and my mediocre finishes on that. But this year, we're in a pandemic. There's no vacations on a beach right now. So I was fully ongoing, ready to go. And just, I've had minor bad luck. I would say minor, though, for the most part.
It feels pretty major. I mean...
It's a bad draft, Justin. We could be honest. I was drafting actually my first ever draft champions because I'm not an NFBC player. I know you play 29 leagues. Is that
29
right?
Total leagues. I think 20 of them are on NFBC. Yeah.
So I've never been a big I have a million leagues with my buddies and stuff like that. But a close friend of mine was like, let's just do a draft champions. All right, let's just do one. I was like, great. All right, fine, let's do one. So it started actually at the exact same moment that TGFBI started. So I was doing both of them at the same time. And it was funny because we'll talk about, I started from the 9th spot and I had my first pick, by the way, Kentucky Derby. I chose the 9th pick deliberately, which never happens. I'm usually one of the last guys. And in part it was because of a conversation with you. But I had another team going at the exact same time, and I actually started Bauer, Darvish. So it was like polar opposites as I'm drafting, and my picks came up at the exact same time every time. So it just whatever. I did have some bad luck, but still, man. I mean, look, I never leave the first 2 rounds without a pitcher ever. Like this whole thing, like I just can't. It makes me uncomfortable, and it just fell that way. I liked Yelich as my 9th pick, and then the pitchers that I wanted went, and I took Harper. And then it just, I don't know. It's been a bad draft. I appreciate you trying to blame it at all on luck, but it's a bad draft, and I'm okay to admit it. I will fight like hell to get it back into contention. I'm also in a very tough league, so it's all crazy, man.
Well, this is great because the majority of the people I've talked to so far this year have had really, really good teams, and so you're a team that kind of in the same situation as me, in which you've just been hit by injuries. I mean, Yelich is out, right now. Zach Gallen missed, the first few weeks of the season. You didn't know he was going to be injured when you took him in the 3rd round. Steven Strasburg, you took him in the 5th round.
Who could have predicted that Steven Strasburg was going to get injured this year? I just don't understand.
You thought you'd get more out of him than this, though.
Well, this is what I'm talking about, man. I'm so mad at myself, and I almost feel like I psych myself out. Like I feel like I'm in like this league. Like I love it. It's great. It's so fun. It's like a 2-week thing where everybody's talking about it, and I feel like every pick, instead of just like when I draft, I'm just kind of like boom, boom, boom. When I'm in this one, I feel like I go through these like permutations in my head of what's going to work. And I feel like I was a little bit of a victim of the fact that I waited on pitching, and I don't do that. And I felt uncomfortable. As much as I loved Zach Gallen, even the second starter, right? I was kind of hoping like maybe Lynn will get there. Maybe Burns will get there. I had those 2 guys higher, and it wasn't. And it turned out to be Snell, who again I liked, but also is not the pinnacle of health. And then you're waiting, and it's like, man, you're in this area where there just aren't good pitchers. And I bought into the whole thing about how like I was avoiding Strasburg. You and I may have talked about it ourselves, because I was like, what is this? What do you mean carpal tunnel syndrome? Like I don't know what that does. Like what is the surgery? How does that affect the pitcher? But everything I heard said it was like totally minor, and he was going to be fine. I was like, all right, seems healthy. Like the upside is there. I'm probably going to need to hit a home run with one of these guys. And then it was Strasburg, and then it was just terrible. I liked Keston Hero, which was my next guy. I really was just like, man, he never struck out like 35% of the time in the minors. Like there's just no way this is going to be a discount, and he just looks completely lost, man. I mean, it's a bad draft, Justin. I can admit it. It's a bad draft.
Well, then how do you rebound? Like, so what is the strategy in terms of, okay, this is the hand you're dealt with. There's not much you can do about it you can't redraft, right? So you've got to work with what you have right now. Like, what do you do in order to try to fix this kind of behind the 8 ball situation you're in?
Right. So normally you could try to trade, but obviously that's not how it works on NFBC. I am in actually a really, really tough spot right now because I had a bunch of injuries in my rotation that kind of led to me falling behind a little bit in the innings and strikeouts department anyway. And I just wasn't getting wins. I don't know how many wins I got a few over the weekend. Yeah, but I have like 5 or something. So I'm in last place there. So the weird spot that I'm in is that I can't afford to kind of pick my spots with pitchers at this point, right? Like I can't afford to be like, don't love the matchup this week. I've got to be careful about it because frankly, if I don't start just getting bodies out there, then I'm just going to fall so far behind in innings and strikeouts that, it's not going to matter if I can get my ERA and WHIP down to somewhere close to respectability. The bigger problem is that my ERA and WHIP are in like astronomically bad territory, right? Like I've got to be close to probably the worst in all of TGFBI, like total standings at it. So what I have done, I'm not usually like this. I've been way more aggressive early on with Fab than I usually am. Like I try not to be crazy because I split the baby a little bit, right? You've got to get, the earlier you get guys on your team, the more impact they're going to have. And later on in the year, a lot of guys are going to check out, so you don't need the Fab advantage. But at the same time, when there's an impact player, I like to make sure I have a lot. Right now, I've just sort of thrown caution to the wind. It's not all glory. I also need closers, by the way. So I just spent a boatload on Rafael Montero, who's dropped, who at the very worst is in a committee, probably, I guess, even though Graveman's a better reliever in the strong side. But in the end, it's being aggressive with Fab, going after starters who are sitting out there and trying to make things work as best I can. Like I spent a lot on Domingo Germán right now to try to get him, a guy who I liked, by the way, coming into the year. Obviously, Devi Garcia is up today, so who knows if that's going to be there. But I'm trying to be as aggressive as I possibly can be with Fab, mostly trying to fill the holes that I can get. And it's not, I mean, I picked up Michael Fulmer, for example, Alex Cobb. These guys are not going to win you your league or anything like that, but just doing my best to keep up with the innings and the strikeouts, maybe get some wins while not absolutely destroying my ERA and WHIP.
All right. I mean, I think you have a pretty good game plan. It's whether or not you're going to be able to kind of execute it to the best of your ability. You're in a better spot than me because I have 0 saves. So
yeah, I do know that. You know, it's funny because what I did, Justin, is when the sort of starting, you know, you got to that area where the starters were like, man, none of these guys, none of them is particularly better than anybody I'm going to get 2 or 3 rounds later. So I wasn't going to dip. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to take the closer that's going to at least give me solid, you know, ratios. And that was James Karinchak, who immediately was like, oh, by the way, you're not the closer anymore. And I was like, okay, I mean, I don't know how many saves I have right now. And I've been aggressive again going after the closers. I've got, you know, Stephon Crichton and everything like that. But really, my saves are pieced together. David Price has a save for me. I mean, that's where I am, right? Like, so I'm not exactly crushing it with stuff like that. The good news, at least, is that the offense is in pretty decent shape. I mean, I lost Brian Hayes kind of early, but for the most, and Yelich obviously is there. But for the most part, even with Hira, you know, they're performing. I've got enough late round guys. I've got JD Martinez. He's obviously been a big boon early on, and Harper has performed as we sort of expected. So at least I'm not chasing sort of this crazy offensive production. It's just a matter of like, maybe Strasburg comes back, maybe I can go on a run, and that's it. But realistically, the bottom line is I have to compete somewhere in pitching, and if the ERA and WHIP aren't going to come, then I at least have to try to compete in strikeouts and WHIP, which, by the way, is something that, you know, in the end, if I could somehow compete in strikeouts and WHIP and saves, then, you know, you can maybe afford to get by without being great in ERA and WHIP. But it's going to be an uphill battle, and I've accepted it, and it is a combination of some bad injury luck, but mostly a poor draft, which I accept and I own.
Well, I'm glad you're willing to own it. I was trying to let you off the hook a little bit. You are in the bottom.
You were so gentle. I was like, wow. I was prepared because you had every right to come on and be like, what were you doing during that draft?
I had no room to like go after anybody because my pitching, my offense, in spite of the fact that it's missing like 4 of its top, 10 picks from the offensive side with, I think I've lost Springer, Cabrini Hayes, Anthony Rendon. And I feel like there's someone else.
The double third baseman.
Yeah.
Playing third base for you right now.
It was Evan Longoria last week who was injured as well. So it's
well, that is your MO though, right? Like, I mean, I've followed you for years, and your whole MO is like your entire team dies immediately.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening. It's like I didn't draft. I drafted 1 injured player and 1 stash in Kalenic as a stash, and then I drafted Framber in the 26th round. And I was like, okay, my team's very, very healthy. And then the season starts, and nobody's healthy. It's just, and then I lost all of my closers already. I had to. Someone dropped Jordan Romano in my league this last week, and early in the week I went, okay, I'm going to put a huge bid on Jordan Romano. And then apparently I thought I had changed it, but I guess I hadn't, because Dolis got 2 saves and I blew $300 on Jordan Romano. So not only do I not have any saves, now I have a lot less fab as well. And I spent $100-something on Kendall Graveman last week. So it's not going well. My wife is going to kick my ass this year.
That's your problem, right?
Yeah.
That's your problem.
She's in my head.
Yeah, that's right. That's the problem. See, my wife is basically like, if you talk to me about fantasy baseball, I will file divorce papers immediately. So I at least she doesn't know how terrible I'm doing all of this, which is like sort of a minor sort of, something that makes me feel a little better. But I will tell you, Justin, rest assured that if you do poorly this year, you can always just look at my team and be like, you know what? I know Dan is taking this really hard. I know that deep down Dan is dying right now because I am. And it's not about like, if anybody sees my finish in the TGFBI, like I don't care about that, but I want to compete for the sake of competing. And I hate it when I play in any league, a league with my freaking kid, my 7-year-old or something like that. If I do poorly, it eats at me a little bit. So it is something where I really look at this team all the time and I'm like, what can I do? What can I do? And realistically, there probably isn't anything I could do, but I promise you I'm going to go down swinging.
Yeah, no, I'm actually doing very well in pretty much all of my other leagues. I think except for Tout Wars, but like both my main event teams are strong. And I said it earlier this year, I could win the NFBC main event overall and lose to my wife, and no one will ever remember that I won the main event. Like that's like
true.
Something's going to happen where I win both my main event leagues and nobody will end up talking about it because, my wife beat me in TGFBI.
And it's not just that she's like got a poor team and like eking ahead of you. She's got like a good team,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, oh yeah. And she's been missing some of her best players.
No.
She's just, it's unreal. But
yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about you, just kind of in general. When did you become a baseball fan?
So I'm definitely I grew up living and breathing baseball. Like baseball was a huge part of growing up. I remember being in my first Mets game. I'm from Queens, so I'm a Mets fan. So I remember going to my first Mets game when I was like 4. It's like the earliest memory I have or something, sitting way up there watching Keith Hernandez play. I was huge into baseball my entire life. And I remember because, growing up in Queens, everybody's a Mets fan, especially in the 80s. And then when the Yankees got good and the Mets weren't so good, everybody just jumped ship to the Yankees. And like, for me, that was not possible, nor would I want to do that, of course. But it just was a huge part of my life. And my father liked baseball when I was younger, and he was kind of a workaholic. And my mother begged me to find him another interest outside of work. And I remember one day basically talking to him about the Mets, and it was like shortly after they had traded for Piazza. So we're like in 1998, and he kind of got into it a little bit. And then he got really, really into it. And then it was just our thing where like he and I had an incredibly close bond, regardless of baseball, but through baseball. I was like a season ticket holder when I worked in New York and everything like that. I live and die with the Mets. So much so that like my law school girlfriend basically said to me, I remember she said, if my entire life is basically, if my day is going to depend on if the Mets won or lost as to if you're going to be in a good mood or not, then I'm out right now, because that's what I was like. And back then the Mets lost way more than they won. So it's been ingrained in me since I was a little kid. I am completely still absolutely obsessed with it. My son is now obsessed with it. So really, it's been a big part of my life forever.
I do kind of understand a little bit of the feeling of like everybody in your area, like transferring their fanship over to a different team, because I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I was a big Washington football team fan. And then the Ravens came to town and they were good, like, right? And so like a bunch of people are like, well, I'm Washington. I mean, they just can't seem to win anything. So a lot of people kind of ran over to become Ravens fans. And I'm just sitting over here like, someday this will pay off. It hasn't yet, but someday.
Well, I was lucky enough that there was nobody who was a Jets fan anyway. Like we didn't start with a base. Like the Mets were good in the 80s, right? So all my friends were like, good. The Jets had been terrible for their entire existence, except for before we were ever alive. So everybody was already a Giants fan. So I've just been holding out here on Mets and Jets Island, because I know one day, might be in like 110 years, but one day that's going to pay off. So I'm holding strong for it.
Well, I'll hold with you.
I'll take it. I need any help I can get. Trust me.
When did you start playing fantasy?
So fantasy, my first fantasy league was I'm pretty sure it was 2004, which is when I was in law school. And I remember one of my close friends, who I still play in a league with right now, I didn't know him at the time. He saw the background on my laptop in the library was a picture, I think, of Tom Glavine in like an FDNY hat or something, right? From September 11th on that day I always wore it. And he was like, hey, are you a Mets fan? And I was like, yeah. He's like, so am I. I was like, oh, we're the ones. That's great. And he was like, hey, I'm thinking of starting this fantasy baseball league. Do you want to play? And I was like, I don't really know anything about fantasy, but I'll try it. And it became a complete obsession, so much so that there were legitimate concerns that we may all fail the bar, because we all stayed up in Ithaca, where we went to law school, for the next summer. So it was the second year of our league. And like, we're in these like bar classes studying and stuff like that. And secretly we're like, okay, Derek Lee, he's just crushing life right now. Like you got to be able to give me back like this and that. Like we're just making trades the entire time. It just took over our entire existence. And it basically still has ever since. Like half the guys I still talk to from law school are just about fantasy baseball. So started in 2004. That's when first time I played any fantasy whatsoever. And it's been like just growing ever since. And if for nothing else, and this is why my wife tolerates my complete obsession with it, it's because it's allowed me to stay in touch with people who I probably never would talk to otherwise, you know?
And that's a really cool aspect of fantasy. I mean, I don't have a fantasy baseball league from high school or anything like that, but I have a fantasy football league that's been running since, I think, my sophomore year of high school. And for some of us, it's the only time we ever communicate is through that fantasy league. And it's a free league. It's just for trash talk. But it's my most important fantasy football league every year. Like, I have to win that league. And I lost to my best friend this year. It was his first year in 20 years winning. And he beat me, even though I had the best team in the league all year. So
I mean, one of the leagues now, which is great, is other than the last 2 years because of the pandemic, we all get together in person in New York, and we're from all over the place, right? Like I live in New Hampshire right now, and we make a weekend out of it, and we come down, and I'm the auctioneer, and we do the whole big thing, and then we go out to a giant steak dinner where I like interview everyone. It's like my best weekend of the year, and we don't do anything. It's not, we just sit around, making fantasy baseball teams and having a nice meal, and it's the best. And it's great because for pretty much 90% of those guys, that's the only time I see them for the whole year. Other than that, it's just texting about like smack talk about each other's teams. Like that's it. So it really is, the camaraderie part of it is just kind of an underrated thing, in addition to the fact that it's completely addicting and takes over my entire life, and I watch 13 baseball games a night anyway. So even regardless of that, it's just about being with friends, and it's great. It's great. I mean, I'm in like 12 leagues now at this point. Not your level yet, but still it keeps growing.
So how did you enter the industry? How'd you go from just being obsessed with playing the game to wanting to talk about it and write about it?
So I'm going to give you the long answer. Okay, you can tell I talk a lot, but I'm going to give you the long answer. There is a parallel universe where I'm a partner in a corporate law firm living in New York, and probably divorced because my wife would never have stood for it, but probably pretty rich and like rolling in the dough and stuff like that. And when I was 26, so like probably a year out of law school, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which now I've had I'm 40, so 14 years already. And for I got treatment very early, but the biggest thing that was like, okay, we made advances in treatment, you were diagnosed early, but the one big thing is like, limit the stress. Okay. Like don't go crazy. I'm like, all right, well, I'm not going to be a partner in a law firm then, because it's just not going to work. So my wife and I sort of had a plan to move to New England eventually at some point to be closer to her family, find a job that was a little less stressful, don't have to worry about making millions of dollars to afford a 1-bedroom apartment or something in New York. Right. So a few years later, we got pregnant. Not planned, but we were married and financially secure, and she's the best thing that ever happened to us, my daughter, Sophie. And I said, okay, well, maybe now's a good time to start looking to move closer to your parents, where, I can get a job that maybe will let me be home more. And so we did, and I got a job clerking for a federal judge, which basically means I help kind of draft opinions and I help run the chambers and everything like that. And it was a wonderful job. It was supposed to be a 1-year job, and it stayed forever. And it was really an absolutely incredible thing. But I went from working 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. down to 9 to 5. And I was like, I've got a little extra time, and I'm kind of a workaholic. And I saw a couple years in, I saw Fantasy Pros tweet out something about, hey, want to write about your favorite team? Join our news desk. And I said, oh, you know what? Maybe there's a little extra money in this for me, right? Like, okay, let's see. So I applied, and turned out to be a volunteer position, but I was like, well, whatever. Like, I like writing. I've written for a living for like the last 12 years. Let's see what this is. And they were great. And they were like, oh, just do 5 updates a week. And I was like, I'm going to do 5 updates an hour. Like, I'm like, forget this. Like, I'm going to crush this, and I'm going to be the best volunteer, whatever. And I was like, I just did, like, I don't know. And to write a news update about like a player was something I could do in my sleep. And I know how to write, right? Which is kind of a lost art a little bit about, right? That, not to be old man on my soapbox, but like the new generation with their texting and their, all this sort of stuff. It's like very much of like the ability to string together a coherent sentence is not always, apparent from everybody. And I could do that pretty easily. And I was obsessed with baseball. So if you want me to talk about a baseball player in a few sentences, that was fine. They let me write a couple of articles. I asked them, am I allowed to be funny? They said yes. And so I started writing kind of a couple of things, just sort of in a mode where like I was telling stuff about myself. I was constantly like using parables to, with my children and stuff like that, ways to sort of make my point and stuff like that. And they were kind of popular, and they just kept giving me a little more and a little more. And then I stopped for a little while because, that I wanted to focus on my regular job. But after a while, like I appeared on a podcast and it went well. And then I kind of had to, like, they asked if I could host a podcast every once in a while, and that went okay. And then before I knew it, they were basically like, hey, we want to talk to you about a full-time position. And I was like, well, I'm not really interested in that. I'm a lawyer. This is a wonderful thing to do, and I love the company and everything's like that. And I was like, but realistically, I'm the sole breadwinner for my family. My wife hadn't even gone back to work yet, so I really don't think it was going to work. And they said, okay, well, we can touch base maybe at some point when it might make more sense. And then eventually they just basically came and were like, look, we have an idea and we want to know what you think. Like, what if you became the editor-in-chief of the company? And I was like, well, that's interesting. Let's talk about that. And it was very much of you sort of have to, direct content in a way, but also provide content still as we know you can, and write and do podcasts. And I remember I was like, my wife will never go for this, but it was the ability to work from home before we knew that everybody would be working from home after the pandemic. But it was flexibility and allow me to go down and see my mother often. She lives in New York, and she's, a widow and disabled. So it would allow me to sort of have a little more freedom for that. And my wife and I went out to a very, very fancy dinner because I knew that was the only way I could get in the door, even at all, to talk about it. And we talked about it, and her reaction was, that's ridiculous. And I said, well, let me just lay it out for you. And by the end of the dinner, she was like, okay, maybe this is the right thing to do. And so I did. And I agreed to come on. And that was in February. And then sports stopped a month later. And I've been trying to catch up ever since. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying I loved being a lawyer. And I'm still barred, so I'm still a lawyer, as my wife constantly reminds me. But I never wanted to work in the industry full-time. And it's just something where I grew with the company to the point where they basically made me an offer where I felt like this would be great. Because I manage a bunch of people. I've always managed a bunch of people. I can do that part of it. And let's see where it goes. And although the pandemic hit and we stopped sports for a while, it's been a really, really fabulous 14 months at this point.
So you said you manage a bunch of people. I mean, there's got to be like hundreds of people that work over at Fantasy Pros that you now manage. Like, how is that working? A lot of people working for free like you did when you first started. Like, how is it balancing different work ethics, different levels of engagement, different levels of competency, as kind of a manager behind the scenes at one of the largest places in the business?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, and again, in terms of managing, I mean, I do a lot of like our team, like analysts and everything like that, and people sort of who help direct content as well. But also the news desk still, which is sort of just free, a lot of people who want to break into the industry and want to learn how to do that. And I try to give them a lot of personal attention as well on all sports, not just MLB, but NFL and NBA and stuff like that. I mean, it's a really, I was lucky enough to, again, when I worked at big law firms in the past, like we always had giant teams, right? We had huge cases, so we had giant teams. So finding everybody's strengths and weaknesses is really kind of what it was about. I am lucky enough, and I don't say this just because like I work there and stuff like that. Like our team, who I didn't know, right? I knew like a couple of the analysts and stuff like that, but I didn't know really anybody who worked at there. Like for the full-time people, I don't know anybody who's on there who doesn't bust their butt. Like all the time, working basically to make sure that the product is the best. Everybody really cares about the output of what they do, and that makes my job so much easier. So frankly, a lot of it is almost just like organization as opposed to kind of like keeping track of like each individual employee, stuff like that. We're on Slack, of course, so we talk all the time. But so much of it is just there are so many little things that go into making the content side of our company kind of move forward that it's so much of it is the organization. I mean, that was the biggest challenge to me, actually. It was like, how do I keep track of the 75 different little things that I need to be sort of monitoring? I had a whiteboard at one point, and that just was like death. That was not working for me at all. I started taking notes. I finally got one, but realistically, it's less about like the individuals and more just about making sure that like the 60 different things that need to happen to make sure that we get to from point A to point D to point B happen. And that is really the most challenging part of it. But in terms of the team, that's why Joe was such a great addition. Like everybody's just hardworking, busts their butt, and tries to put out the best product they can. So it's been easier in that respect than I thought it would be.
Well, what's next for you in Fantasy Pros? You're leaving the football podcast, focusing on the baseball, focusing on kind of a lot of the day-to-day operations. What's next for Dan Harris and Fantasy Pros?
Some sleep, I hope. But I am, so, Joe and I sort of tag team the baseball podcast right now, and he's taken over for me on the Betting Pros side podcast as well. I mean, Joe's a professional host, basically. He can host anything in his sleep at this point. And he's hosting the regular NFL pod. I'm not going away. It's sort of, I have people reaching out being like, what happened to you? Like, where are you? Blah, 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 blah. I'm not slinking off into, Anonymousville or anything like that. I'm going to be here. We're going to continue our baseball coverage all year long, of course. We're going to start a new podcast for the NFL side. So I'll appear on the podcast regularly, but we're starting a new thing. So leading off, which Joe and I do, is now a 2-man show, but it was originally a 1-man show, which I would record every night at like 2 a.m. myself, like a 15-minute, like, here's what you missed from the night before. That was really tiring, but it worked for me. We're going to try to do a little bit of the same thing this year for the NFL, just kind of like and it's going to be my own thing, just doing it solo every morning, kind of keeping you up to date on what's going on and stuff like that. Other than that, it's just basically about kind of, managing the ship and making sure it goes right. I love doing content. I would probably do content all the time if I had the time, but for the most part, it's going to be continuing to grow our baseball content, which, by the way, is something that's really important to me, because I felt like last year, and I mean, I'm sure you're aware, we had some personnel issues, but that is why I became the host of the NFL podcast. And because of that, I couldn't really devote anything to baseball with the shortened season or anything like that. So my big focus now, and Joe is so passionate about baseball too, was just to make sure from start to finish, we are here for our baseball consumers, So that is a big part of what I'm going to make sure about, is that from start to finish of the MLB season, we are here with the podcast, with all our content, everything for the baseball people. So that's really it. Just kind of, here and there, and trying to make sure that we finish both the MLB and NFL seasons from start to finish.
All right. Well, that sounds amazing. And I told you after you hired Joe that I thought it was such a great move, and Joe's a great buddy of mine and such a strong personality and strong player that I felt like it was kind of a fantastic fit for Fantasy Pros, and I was super happy that he landed that role. So I'm excited to continue to listen to you guys all throughout the baseball season.
Yeah, Joe, look, Joe's great. I mean, and Joe, we had such a relationship with Joe before, we decided to hire him, because he appeared on the podcast so many times because he's so good at it, and it's so natural. It's almost obnoxious a little bit, just how natural he is. Because when I host a podcast, it's like 4 hours of work, like to prep for it, and does like, and he like rolls out of bed. He's like, all right, guys, so here's, and he does it like 20 times better than I could. So yeah, Joe's been a great addition. And from just a personal standpoint, like, we both love baseball, and it's so wonderful to kind of be, I mean, I'm sure you feel this way with Sporer, my long lost cousin Sporer, that like to just talk every day. Like, it's not work to do that podcast, like every morning I wake up and Joe's like, all right, here, let's talk about what we think. And I talk about baseball with, and my cat for like, 4 hours if I had to. So it's really great. He's a fantastic addition. I was super excited when we were able to add him. So yeah, I'm excited to see what he's going to do in the NFL season and for years to come.
Yeah, I mean, Paul and Joe are both cut from the same cloth. They're just so easy to talk to, so easy to get along with, and really just bring a lot to any program that they're on. And so I feel blessed to have Paul is my co-host on the Sleeper and the Bust, as I'm sure you feel blessed to have Joe as your co-host over at Fantasy Pros.
Yeah, and especially because, frankly, I mean, he leads the show, so it's great, right? Like, for me, I always feel like it's a lot easier for me when I'm in the quote-unquote analyst chair, even though he's my co-host, really. He's like more of the sets up the stuff, because that part of it, I don't know about you, because you host 30,000 podcasts, but when you're prepping for them, for me, that was the biggest thing for me as to how much more work for me went into hosting a podcast rather than just either being a guest or an analyst. Do you feel that way, by the way, or are you like same for you either way?
I mean, it's somewhat similar. Prep wise, I don't do prep. So, I tell people whenever they ask me to be a guest on, just like, let me know if you're going to make me actually come up with something. Like, if you want like 3 players that I think are going to break out, just make sure you let me know that, because otherwise I don't read the show notes. I just wait for the question to come and I answer. And that comes from working with Paul for so long, because Paul literally gives me the rundown the moment before we start. Like, so there's no, like, I don't have time to go look up stats. Everything is either off the top of my head or like what I can look up in the moment when he asks. The difference for me between hosting and being kind of in the analyst chair is just how I approach the dynamic of the show, right? You know, take a basketball reference. If you're the host, you have to be the point guard. It's not about you scoring the points. It's about helping other people score the points. Right. Whereas, when Paul's hosting and I'm in the analyst chair, I get to take the shots, right? And so he's going to try to set me up the best he can.
Yeah. And by the way, I do feel like that was a wonderful thing that happened this year for the first time for me, because I think it was the first time I was like sort of regularly hosting, because I was on all the time with Joe and hosting a bit even in the spring before the season got started. But it did become to the point where I don't need to, like, you don't need to tell me what we're going to talk about. Exactly your point, though. Just don't come up and be like, you know what, give me 3 names of people who you think, might do. I'm like, no, I can't do that off the top of my head. That I need a little prep. But other than that, it was wonderful to be at a place where I didn't care, right? Like, I don't need the notes. Like, just let's talk about whoever you want. I'm good to go. That was really a wonderful sort of thing, because it was the first time I'd been like, every day I'm just sort of kind of talking baseball as much as it was. So that really was great. But yeah, again, with Joe, it's so easy. And he and I sort of have joked about how we really do get along. We feel like we're old friends, we're brothers, whatever it is, because we really do just kind of, it's just, we roll out of bed in the morning and it's like, all right, man, what do we got? What's going on here? So it's really great. Honestly, I feel really lucky that we found him and that he, agreed to come on board with us.
Well, I'm glad you guys picked him up, because it was a great decision, I think, on your guys' part. Remind everybody where you can reach social media, and then plug again everything at Fancy Pros.
Yeah, again, I'm at Dan Harris 80, where you can find me. My work, generally speaking, is I'll tweet out my articles. At this point, it's kind of cut down. I mainly do a trade chart, which I publish every Thursday morning for Roto Leagues. And then I do a 2-start look ahead article where I try to basically note a couple of pitchers who will be making 2 starts the week after this coming week, in case you have room to stash them at all. And again, really the easiest way to find anything that I do is at my Twitter account at Dan Harris 80, but also subscribe to the Fantasy Pros Baseball Podcast, the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast, and be on the lookout for a new podcast that will be dropping sometime in August for football, which I will also be hosting.
Awesome. And then I always like to end with one last question, which is, if someone's listening to this and they go, oh man, like, I'm so impressed by Dan and I want to be like him. I want to work my way up. I want to run a company like Fantasy Pros. Like, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give someone who's thinking that way?
Okay, first, if you are out there thinking you're impressed by Dan and you want to be like Dan, you just need to reevaluate some of your priorities, just to make it clear. But if you're this is like, I guess, less of the break into the fantasy industry and be more on the management side. I would say that I think, I don't know, Justin, I feel like what separates certain employees from others or certain people doing any sort of work is just like, I always cared about what I was doing and making sure that I was not letting down anybody who was depending on me. Like, I really feel like what brought me to this point was just the fact that if there was a deadline, I was going to hit that deadline. Like there was no, oh, whoops, I forgot, which so many people do, by the way, which is, it surprises me because I know you're not that dude. I mean, you work your butt off like nonstop. Like that surprises me how many people would just be like, oh man, I can't tell you. And running the news desk, by the way, that's where it really, people wanting to break into the industry, you'd be like, I'm going to be the best news desk correspondent you have ever had in your entire life. And it would be like 2 updates where I would give them feedback and then I'd never hear from them again. Like that happens all the time. But bottom line is be dependable. That goes so much further than it costs you, right? Like the benefit is so much greater than the cost it is to you to just make sure if you take on something, do it and do it well, by the way. I mean, one of the things I remember is one of the first pieces of feedback I got. I wrote an article about Giancarlo Stanton. He was struggling, I think, in the beginning. And I wrote an article. This was still, again, back a little bit before the data got so like apparent to everybody, before I think, Baseball Savant and everything like that. And it was about Giancarlo Stanton, how he was, and it was like a 6,000 word article. And I remember the guy who I submitted articles to passed back the feedback from the editors, which said, how do you write a 6,000 word article without a single grammatical or spelling typo? And it was because I read it 40 times before I submitted it. Things like that get noticed and go a long way and make people think that you are somebody who they can rely on for even bigger roles than just being, somebody who doesn't have any management role, which is great, by the way. Be just a fancy analyst is fantastic. But if you want to sort of do that, I think what really set me apart was reliability and just kind of the care that I showed in trying to do my work to the best of my ability, even when I wasn't getting paid for it. It was just about really priding yourself on your ability to be reliable and do your work to the best way you can.
Wow, that's an amazing answer. I really, really like that. I mean, it's I manage a few people over at Friends Fancy Benefits, and the dependability factor tells me who is going to stick around for longer than others, right?
Right.
If you tell me you're gonna, and I tell them, like, you can write weekly, write every other week, you write monthly, but just stick to whatever it is.
Exactly.
And those guys that stick and women who stick to the schedule that they set out for themselves, it tells me a lot about how long I think they're going to be with me, or how long before someone's going to scoop them up in the industry and pay them more than I can.
Right. No, and that's exactly it. And also, by the way, like this is something even that I talk about with my wife, but with everybody. Like there can be small tasks, right? Mm-hmm. Small things that don't matter, that are like, on a list of priorities, it's like the 1500th highest priority. Nobody cares. But if it's under your purview, do it, and do it to the best that you can, and make sure that if somebody thinks that this is something you're going to do, that every time that it's supposed to be done, that it's just done. That is such an easy thing. That is such an easy thing for someone to do. And it goes so far with people. And that's when I notice people, for sure, it's like, oh man, I had actually forgotten that this was even a task that we had to do. And this person has just been doing it without ever me thinking about it or needing to follow up on it. That just goes so far, man. Even if you just want to be, a fantasy analyst just there, that's a key component of it too. But if you want to sort of go further, I really, truly believe that without that, I'm not where I am today.
Oh, Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
I can't tell you how much I enjoy talking to you, Justin. I'm a huge fan of you, of your wife, of all the work that you do. And I really, this is kind of the first time. I know you appeared on the podcast at one point when I hosted, but the first time that like we've really gotten to talk. And honestly, I won't use the word honor, but it was a privilege to be here talking to you.
Well, we'll definitely have to do it again sometime.
Sure.
That will do it for another episode of the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational Podcast. I am Justin Mason. You can reach me on Twitter at JustinMasonFWFB, and you can reach TGFBI on Twitter at TGFBI. You can read all my work over on Fangraphs, where I write daily, on friendsoffantasybenefits.com, at Fantasy Alarm, and at TGFBI.com. You can also hear me on the Friends of Fantasy Benefits podcast and the Sleeper in the Bust podcast. I want to thank Dan Harris of Fantasy Pros for coming on. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully people will continue to listen and subscribe and give us a 5-star review if you feel so inclined. It really helps out the podcast. That will do it for this episode. For Dan and myself, thank you for listening. Have a fantastic baseball season.